Dag iedereen. Na Pinksteren vermeerderen de kerken overal in de Middellandse Zee. Dat is onze thema van vandaag. Er is een klein introfilmpje om ons te herinneren aan wat na Pinksteren gebeurt. Ja, ik mag die doorgeven, Thomas, alsjeblieft.
Story in a second volume.
Called the Book of Acts, and it's all about what Jesus continued to do after his resurrection.
Acts begins with the disciples who are hanging out with Jesus, who's just come back to life, which is mind-blowing to imagine.
And then for weeks, the risen Jesus kept teaching them about his upside-down kingdom, the new creation that he launched through his death and resurrection.
This is exciting stuff, and the disciples are ready to go tell the world.
But then Jesus tells them to wait and to stay in Jerusalem until they receive a new kind of power so they can be faithful witnesses to Jesus and his kingdom. Then he says that their mission is going to begin in Jerusalem, then move out to Judea and Samaria, and then from there out into the nations. It's like a roadmap for the whole book of Acts. Then the disciples saw Jesus enthroned as king of all creation.
So the disciples wait, wondering when this power is going to come. And then comes the time of Pentecost.
So this is an ancient Israelite festival. It's during the early summer, and thousands of Jewish pilgrims would come back to Jerusalem from all over the world, all these different languages and cultures colliding in the city.
And the disciples are together in a house, which is suddenly filled with rushing wind along with fire. Fire splinters off into tongues of fire hovering over people's heads. What's this all about?
Yeah, so Luke is tapping into a repeated Old Testament theme. When God's presence showed up similarly at Mount Sinai, he made a covenant with Israel and gave them the Ten Commandments. Then later, when God's glory came in a pillar of fire, it filled the tabernacle when he came to live among them.
That was just one pillar of fire, not many.
Exactly. Luke's making an important point here. This is God's personal temple presence, God's spirit that was foretold by Israel's prophets. And now it's come to take up residence in the new temple of Jesus' body, that is, his people. They've become little mobile temples where God now dwells.
And they start to tell stories about Jesus, but they're speaking in languages that they didn't know before, yet all the visitors can understand them. What's this all about?
Well, Peter gets up to explain that this is the fulfillment of Israel's hopes based on the scriptures. God's plan was always to use the unified family of Abraham to bring peace and justice to the world. But the tribes of Israel had been scattered because of the exile. Now here at Pentecost, representatives from all of the tribes come back together and they're introduced to their Messiah, the crucified and risen Jesus, so they can now become the restored people of Israel.
And thousands of them start following the way of Jesus.
Which brings us to Luke's tale of two temples. So you've got the temple that Herod built in Jerusalem, where Jesus' disciples worship like the rest of the Israelites. But now there's also Jesus' temple, which consists of people. This temple's meeting together in homes all over Jerusalem, and they were approaching life in a radical new way.
Right, think about it. Many of these pilgrims aren't even from Jerusalem, so they've formed these new families, and they're all depending on each other.
Yeah, people would sell their stuff, provide for the poor among them. They ate their meals together. They said their daily prayers together.
They were learning from the apostles what it meant to live as if Jesus is the true king of the world. And it must have been exhilarating. The movement is broken out.
And so back in Jerusalem, Peter is now telling the other apostles about what happened, and they start getting reports about even more non-Jewish people following Jesus up in the big trade city north called Antioch. So they send a man there named Barnabas to check things out.
Barnabas finds the Jesus movement alive and well in Antioch, and he finds it's made up of people from all over the world.
And so Barnabas recruits Saul to come and work with him in Antioch for a year. They're teaching, living among the people there, watching the movement grow.
The church in Antioch was the first international Jesus community, and it is where Jesus' followers were first called Christians, the Christ ones.
And so the way of Jesus was transformed from a group of Messianic Jews in Jerusalem into the multi-ethnic Jesus movement spreading through the world. Their faith was the same. It was centered on the good news about the crucified Jesus, who is the King of all nations.
But that message and their new way of life was confusing, even threatening to the average Roman citizen living around them.
And the resulting conflict is what we'll explore next as this movement goes global. Or as Jesus said, to the ends of the earth.
Dank u Thomas. Na Pinksteren hadden de eerste christenen, die na het feest in Jeruzalem naar huis terugkeerden, ze hadden maar één ding in hun hoofd. Wij hebben de verrezen Christus Jezus met onze ogen gezien. Velen waren gedoopt. Ze probeerden te leven volgens de boodschap die Jezus hun had gegeven en ze waren vervuld met de Heilige Geest. Maar vandaag, 2000 jaar later, men zou de vraag kunnen stellen, is dit allemaal echt gebeurd? Is Christus echt uit de dood opgestaan? Is dit echt? Welk bewijs hebben wij vandaag? Ik zou zeggen, we hebben minstens 2 bewijzen of 2 zeer goede argumenten hebben die we kunnen brengen als we het over de opstanding van Jezus hebben. Ten eerste, er zijn alle teksten die gevonden zijn en die spreken over zijn opstanding. Niet alleen teksten uit de Bijbel of christelijke teksten, maar ook veel andere teksten die ervan getuigen. Getuigenissen van mensen die de verrezen Jezus echt hebben gezien. Als de opstanding van Jezus niet was gebeurd, de apostel Paulus en de andere schrijvers hadden zo een duidelijk getuigenis aan hun tijdgenoten niet kunnen geven. 16 jaar na de dood van Christus specifieert Paulus dat meer dan 500 mensen de opgestane Jezus hebben gezien en dat de meesten nog in leven zijn. Als de opstanding niet had plaatsgevonden, hoe had Paulus dan zo'n lange lijst van ooggetuigen kunnen delen? Paulus zou onmiddellijk alle geloofwaardigheid hebben verloren in het bijzijn van zijn Korinthische lezers, door zo schaamteloos te liegen. Als Jezus niet was opgestaan, wat voor zin had dan voor de discipelen om vervolging en dood onder oog te zien? Welke materiële voordeel haalden zij eruit? Maar een tweede punt lijkt mij nog duidelijker bewijs te zijn. De geboorte van christelijke gemeenschap rondom de Middellandse Zee. Wanneer de leider van een beweging wordt geëlimineerd, houdt die beweging in principe ook op te staan. Wat het christendom betreft is het tegenovergesteld gebeurd. De leider werd opzij geschoven en het christendom explodeerde, ondanks de vervolging van de eerste christenen. Wat een bewijs! Dit feit kan vandaag, 2000 jaar later, niemand negeren. In feite werd Jezus niet echt opzij gezet en de geest van God nam het over. Wie zijn sommige leiders om tegen Gods plan in te gaan? En Gods plan was om het goede nieuws over de hele wereld te verspreiden. Hier is nog een korte video die erover praat. Ja, Thomas, wil jij de volgende kleine video? Dank u.
The people who believed the apostles' message began to meet together, and someone in Antioch came up with a nickname for them, Christians, because they followed Christ. Paul and Peter and a few others wrote letters to these groups of Christians, called churches, and you can read some of them in the Bible. Around about now, the first book about Jesus' life was written. It's called Mark, and you can read that in the Bible too. In the following 50 years or so, the books of Matthew, Luke and John appeared, all with a slightly different take on Jesus' life. Most Christians believe that Peter became the very first bishop of Rome, a dangerous place to be. Fire destroyed most of the city, and rumours spread that the Emperor Nero had started it to clear the land for a massive palace. He needed someone else to blame, so he picked on the Christians. No one liked Christians. Everyone thought they were superstitious because they didn't follow the Roman religion, or even the Jewish one. They were probably criminals because their leader, Jesus, had been executed. And they were cannibals because they ate bodies and drank blood. They didn't. It was the bread and wine of the Lord's Supper, of course. All a misunderstanding, but the upshot was that thousands of Christians were persecuted and killed. Nero used them as human candles, and many more met gory deaths in the circus. Not that kind of circus, that kind of circus. Peter and Paul were probably executed around now. The story goes that Peter was crucified upside down and Paul was beheaded. The other apostles were all killed too, apart from John, who was the only one to die of old age. But Christianity continued to grow. The churches were run by bishops, and the first ones, along with other Christian thinkers of the time, are known as the Church Fathers. Most of them were killed as well.
Dank u, Thomas. De christenen zijn vervolgd in Jeruzalem en Rome en op andere plaatsen. Het resultaat is dat ze verspreid zijn over de hele Middellandse Zee en later over de hele wereld. Maar wat was de boodschap van de vroegere christenen? En wat was hun motor? De rode draad van Jezus' boodschap aan zijn discipelen was het Koninkrijk der Hemelen. Jezus had hen er al eerder over verteld in veel van zijn gelijkenissen. Maar wanneer hij na zijn opstanding weer aan zijn discipelen verschijnt, staat er in de Bijbel dat hij de schriften aan hen uitlegde en hen vertelde over het Koninkrijk der Hemelen. Maar wat is het Koninkrijk der Hemelen? Hier is nog een korte video die ons over vertelt.
It's the Greek word euangelion, and it's also sometimes translated with the word gospel.
Yeah, so when Christians say, "Do you believe the gospel?" they mean, "Do you believe the news?"
But not just any news. In the Bible, this phrase is always about the announcement of the reign of a new king. And in the New Testament, the Gospels use this phrase to summarize all of Jesus' teachings. They say that he went about proclaiming the good news of God's kingdom.
So Jesus saw himself as the messenger, bringing the news that God reigns.
Yes, but the way that he described God's reign, it surprised everybody. I mean, think, a powerful, successful kingdom. It needs to be strong, able to impose its will, able to defeat its enemies. But Jesus said the greatest person in God's kingdom was the weakest, the one who loves and who serves the poor. And he said that you live under God's reign when you respond to evil by loving your enemies and forgiving them and seeking peace. This is an upside-down kingdom.
Now, Jesus also said that this kingdom was arriving with him.
Yeah, so for example, there's this really interesting story where there's a high-ranking Roman officer, and he comes to Jesus begging him to heal his servant. And he even calls Jesus his Lord, acknowledging that Jesus is his authority. Jesus praises this man for recognizing what no one else yet had, that not only was Jesus announcing God's kingdom, he was the king.
And so the word gets out that this Jewish man from Galilee is talking and acting like he's the king of Israel. He's appointing 12 disciples, which are an image of Israel's 12 tribes. He's healing people, forgiving people their sins.
And all of this so threatened Israel's leaders that they finally decide to have him killed. And Jesus let them.
Yeah, which is a weird thing to do if you're trying to become king.
That's right. But for Jesus, this is what had to happen. Good news now is that Jesus has defeated death and that he reigns as king, that he's dealt with our sin and corruption himself, and that he's conquered it with his life and with his love.
And then Jesus sends his followers to go out and keep announcing this good news of the upside-down kingdom.
And to invite everyone to give their allegiance to him, the king who defeated death with his love.
In deze kleine video wordt ons verteld over een omgekeerd koninkrijk. Jezus vertelt ons dat de grootste mensen in het koninkrijk de zwakste zijn. De grootste zijn zij die de armste lief hebben en helpen. Hij zegt ook dat je de wil van God doet wanneer je kwaad met goed beantwoordt. Wanneer je je vijanden lief hebt. Wanneer je vergeeft en wanneer je vrede zoekt. Het koninkrijk der hemel is daarom een omgekeerd koninkrijk. Jezus voegt eraan toe dat de koninkrijk der hemelen, zijn koninkrijk, komt door zijn komst hier op aarde. Hij is de koning van dat koninkrijk. En hij bewijst het ons door ons een goed voorbeeld te geven. Hij probeert niet met geweld aan de macht te komen. Integendeel, hij ging naar de zwaksten en de armen. Hij hield van hen tot de dood. Hij hield van ons tot de dood. Hij hield van zijn vijand tot het einde. Ja, Jezus was echt Gods Zoon van God. Hij was echt de Zoon van God. Welke mens zou dat kunnen? Voor mij is het eigenlijk het beste bewijs dat het zo allemaal is gegaan. God houdt van ons en hij is almachtig. Almachtig betekent dat alles mogelijk is. Alles kan. Maar in feite, in dit hele verhaal, wanneer Jezus spreekt over de armen, wie zijn de armen? Jezus zegt in Matthäus 5 in de bergrede, zalig zijn de armen van geest. In feite zijn wij de armen. In dit omgekeerd koninkrijk, in het koninkrijk der hemelen, is het de koning die naar ons toe komt. Ik denk dat nu een goed moment is om de maaltijd van de Heer te vieren. Dus Jezus is de koning hij komt naar ons toe. Dat is een omgekeerde koninkrijk. Hij was met zijn discipelen en hij brak het brood. Hij gaf het aan zijn discipelen en hij zei, dat is mijn lichaam voor jullie gebroken. Hij nam de wijnbeker en hij zei, dat is mijn bloed. Dat is zoals mijn bloed. Door mijn bloed zullen jullie gewassen zijn van jullie zonden. Dank u, Heer Jezus, dat wij mogen voor altijd met u zijn. U heeft voor onze zonde betaald. En we zijn vrij. En door uw offer en uw genade mogen wij voor eeuwig in uw aanwezigheid zijn, met u zijn. Dank u.